Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We're listening To Kill Again.
Identify a suspect, but their case must be pulled from the trash. Investigators hope new forensic techniques can establish a link among the murders and put an end to the violent rampage. In California, a missing persons case leads detectives to a secret burial ground at a Sacramento boarding house. An unlikely suspect becomes the focus of a mass murder investigation. Can science help unmask the murderer hiding behind a kindly face? Homicide investigators find that things aren't always what they appear to be. Seemingly insignificant clues may expose a pattern and put police on the trail of a killer whose compulsion is to kill again. On the morning of December 21st, 1984, in Wichita Falls, Texas, Lisa Boone returned home from her job at a local hospital and found herself locked out. Lisa asked her landlady to unlock the apartment. She'd given her keys to Terry Sims, a friend and co-worker who was spending the night. But Terry wasn't answering the door. Inside, the women found the apartment had been ransacked. Lisa called out to Terry, but got no response. Terry. The landlady noticed blood on the floor and followed the trail. It led to Terry Sims' body. Officers from the Wichita Falls Police Department responded to the scene. Upstairs, they found the 20-year-old victim dead on the bathroom floor. She was nude, except for socks. Her hands had been tied behind her back. Police processed the scene, looking for any clue that might identify the killer. They collected blood samples, a pair of white tennis shoes with the laces still tied, and a woman's hospital uniform. They also recovered a blood-stained bedspread and sheets. At the police station, Lisa told detectives that she and Terry Sims left the hospital together after working the 3 to 11 shift. She explained that she was also a part-time student at Midwestern State University and had an exam the next day. Terry was going to stay the night at Lisa's apartment to help her study in the morning. But Lisa said the hospital was short-staffed that night, so she volunteered for an extra shift. She dropped her friend off at the apartment around 12:30, gave Terry her keys, and returned to work. Lisa told police she'd arrived back home around 7 a.m. and knocked on the door. She had no idea who could have murdered her friend. An autopsy was performed on Terry Sims, and cause of death was determined to be multiple stab wounds to the chest and back. While there was no sign of forcible rape, biological evidence was collected from the victim's body. Most murder victims know their killers, so Wichita Falls police began interviewing Terry Sims' family and friends. They quickly focused on her ex-boyfriend. He denied involvement. Investigators had little evidence against him. but they had a new forensic tool in their arsenal. In 1984, DNA profiling was in its infancy and held the potential to link a killer to his crime through biological evidence left at the scene. But large amounts of evidence were needed to successfully perform the tests. Hoping samples recovered in Terry Sims' case might identify her murderer, police submitted them to the Gene Screen Lab in Dallas. But their hopes were soon dashed. There wasn't enough material for DNA testing. With no hard evidence linking a suspect to the murder, the investigation stalled, and the case remained unsolved. On February 15, 1985, 2 months after Terry Sims was found murdered, an electric company employee was working on a transformer just outside the Wichita Falls city limits. He made a horrifying discovery. He stumbled upon a woman's body. He called 911. Deputies from the Archer County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. In the woods, they found the victim. Nearby, they recovered a leather jacket, a blood-stained nurse's uniform, and a pair of sneakers with the laces still tied. A search of police databases turned up a missing person fitting the victim's description. An autopsy confirmed her identity as Toni Gibbs, a 23-year-old nurse from Wichita Falls, reported missing by her brother a month earlier. The pathologist determined that she died from stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. Biological evidence was collected from the victim's body. Archer County investigators developed several suspects. They soon focused on a man named Danny Wayne Laughlin. He was the last person seen with Toni Gibbs. He had also been held on suspicion of rape in Kansas City, Missouri, less than a year before. Laughlin denied killing Toni Gibbs, but 3 separate polygraph tests suggested deception. At investigators' request, he provided blood and hair samples for DNA testing. Though the results were inconclusive, police believed they had the right man. Laughlin stood trial for the murder of Toni Gibbs. The jury was unable to reach a verdict. A mistrial was declared. Laughlin was never tried again. The Gibbs case remained open. On October 10, 1985, a maintenance worker was cutting grass alongside a road in Wichita County. In the overgrowth, he discovered a woman's body. He called the Wichita County Sheriff's Department. When deputies responded, they found the body of a woman, nude except for one side. There were no clues as to the victim's identity. Police searched the surrounding area and found her clothing nearby. They also recovered a pair of sneakers with the laces tied. An autopsy was performed, but advanced decomposition made it difficult to determine how the woman died. Based on available evidence, however, the medical examiner concluded the cause of death to be undetermined homicidal violence. Wichita County Sheriff's deputies determined that the victim fit the description of a woman reported missing a month earlier. She was identified as 21-year-old Ellen Blau. They interviewed two suspects who had been with her the night she was last seen. But deputies had insufficient evidence to charge them. After several months, the case remained unsolved. While the three cases were investigated by different law enforcement agencies, they all fell under the jurisdiction of the Wichita County District Attorney's Office. Barry Maka had recently been elected district attorney and took over just days after Terry Sims' murder. The unsolved murders haunted him.
The absolute terror that they went through in the final minutes of their lives motivated me to find the person responsible for their deaths.
But investigators in each of the cases had exhausted all their leads, and there was nothing more Maka could do. More than a decade would pass before there was a break in the unsolved murders. By 1996, more than 11 years had passed since the murders of Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs, and Ellen Blau in Texas. Police still had no viable suspects in any of the murders. But improved forensic procedures prompted the Wichita County District Attorney to request a re-examination of the evidence from two of the three murders. Some of the evidence was sent to Glenn Unash, a latent print examiner at the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Austin. He found a partial print on a sneaker recovered from the Terry Sims murder scene that had gone undetected. It didn't belong to Terry Sims. However, there was insufficient detail to make a comprehensive analysis. Because blood will darken as it absorbs the light, Unash hoped more ridge characteristics would emerge under laser light. He was disappointed. There was one more option, a dye staining technique. But there was a risk involved.
The dye staining technique could possibly destroy what is there, so the print was photographed prior to that. Once I got that photograph back, I examined it to make sure I recorded all the characteristics.
Unash was now ready to try the dye staining process. He saturated the print with amino black, which reacts to proteins in blood and turns them dark blue or black. But the process didn't develop any further ridge detail. The evidence enhancement he had hoped for eluded him. Over the next 3 years, he examined a series of suspect prints provided by the Wichita County District Attorney's Office and compared them to the one found on Terry Sims' sneaker.
I did not identify any of the suspects that they had sent me. Reported to them that the print appears to be partial second, third joint or another area of the palm. They started sending me in some palm prints. I made those comparisons. I still did not identify the print.
At the same time, DNA testing of the biological samples from the Sims and Gibbs cases was again underway at GeneScreen in Dallas. A new technology, PCR analysis, could provide forensic scientist Judy Floyd with more conclusive results than previous tests.
The requirements were not as stringent, and therefore we were able to use this very old, very degraded DNA and obtain a genetic profile of the perpetrator.
The new DNA process eliminated all previous suspects, including Danny Wayne Laughlin, who had stood trial for the murder of Tony Gibbs a decade earlier. But it did turn up a startling piece of evidence. Biological samples recovered from both victims came from the same individual. Emerging technology and improved forensics had linked two apparently unrelated cases. Now there was evidence a serial killer had claimed the lives of Terry Sims and Tony Gibbs. District Attorney Barry Maka wondered if some of the other unsolved cases were related. He began taking a closer look at those files. One caught his attention, that of Ellen Blau. Maka noted that circumstances of her murder were similar to the Sims and Gibbs homicides. Down to the sneakers, laces still tied, found by her nude body. On January 12, 1999, Maka asked his investigator, John Little, to review the three cases and try to develop a suspect. He also gave Little a possible lead. Though the victims had been discovered in three different police jurisdictions, they all lived within a relatively small geographical area.
Because of the close proximity, I felt that the person responsible for their deaths had some connection to that neighborhood. And so I emphasized that to John and asked him to review the files and see if he could establish anyone with a connection to the neighborhood that may be involved in the cases.
Little began by probing for common threads among the women. It didn't take him long to find them. He noticed that they all shared several physical characteristics.
All the victims were around the same age, pretty much the same build. They were all around 5 foot tall, not much taller. They all weighed 120 pounds or less. They all seemed to have pretty much the same features.
A distinct pattern was emerging, suggesting all three women had been killed by the same person. Then he found a name in the Ellen Blau file. A man named Farian Wardrip. While in custody on a murder charge back in 1986, Wardrip had told police that he knew Blau. It meant nothing to the police at the time. Little wondered if it meant anything now. He learned Wardrip had worked as an orderly at the same hospital as Tony Gibbs. And records showed that he had left that job 4 days after the first victim, Terry Sims, was found murdered. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more connections between Wardrip and the three women. He had lived in the apartment downstairs from Ellen Blau. That apartment was 2 blocks from the residence where Terry Sims was murdered. When Ellen Blau was murdered, Wardrip no longer lived at her apartment complex. He had moved to a residence across the street from the sub shop where she worked. Authorities had placed Wardrip in the neighborhood and established links between him and the victims. They were a long way from proving murder, but now they felt they were finally on the right track. A background check confirmed that Wardrip was a convicted murderer. He had confessed to killing a Wichita Falls woman in 1986. According to the records, he'd fled to Galveston, but turned himself in to police there. Sentenced to 35 years in prison, Wardrip had been paroled in 1997. During the 11 years he was incarcerated, there were no murders in Wichita Falls that were similar to those of Sims, Gibbs, or Blau.
And I felt like he was a very strong suspect. But the only way to find out for sure if he was the one responsible for these murders or not was to obtain a DNA sample.
Although circumstantial evidence pointed to Wardrip, it wasn't enough to obtain a court order before suit could provide DNA samples. Maka and Little decided to try to collect them surreptitiously. Their plan would require surveillance. Investigators contacted Wardrip's parole officer for information.
Where's he living?
They learned that Wardrip lived in nearby Alney, Texas, where he taught Sunday school and worked at a window screen company. According to the parole officer, Wardrop was being electronically monitored and was restricted to his apartment complex unless he was at work or church. And that posed problems for investigators. For 3 days, they watched Wardrop at work behind a locked chain-link fence. He seemed to be beyond their reach. But on the 4th day, they got a break. On February 5th, 1999, the fence was unlocked and Wardrop was outside. He was with his wife, eating crackers and drinking coffee from a disposable cup. When he tossed the cup into a trash can just inside the gate, it was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The undercover investigator approached Wardrop and asked if he could get a tobacco spit cup. Wardrop told him to help himself. With that, any evidence obtained by investigators would be admissible in a court of law. He retrieved Wardrop's cup. Investigators hoped they now had their DNA sample. But would a few drops of coffee and cracker crumbs be enough to prove murder? More than a dozen years had passed since the murders of Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs, and Ellen Blau in Wichita Falls, Texas. Investigators had finally gathered physical evidence they hoped would prove Varian Wardrop was the killer. Now it was up to Gene Screen Lab in Dallas. Judy Floyd carefully swabbed the lip of the cup to collect Wardrop's saliva. When she compared that to DNA samples retrieved from the Sims and Gibbs murders, she was able to establish a match. And there was more. She discovered that Wardrop's profile was unique. He had not one, but 4 very rare markers in his genetic profile.
His profile was so rare that you would expect it to occur only one time in several thousand times the population of the Earth. And in effect, we were able to say that we have established identity with this particular individual through the evidence involved in Ms. Sims and Ms. Gibbs' case.
Investigators didn't stop there. At the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, Glenn Unash compared Wardrop's fingerprints to the partial print found on Terry Sims' sneaker. They matched. Besides making a positive identification, Unash could explain much more.
I can also determine how that shoe was held or when that print was left on that shoe. And it was in a direction that the defendant held the shoe or was taking the shoe off the victim's foot, somewhat similar to this, which would be consistent with pulling it off of the victim's foot.
Investigators' patience and ingenuity had paid off. It was time to take Wardrop into custody. They again enlisted the cooperation of his parole officer. On the pretense of a meeting, Wardrop was summoned to the parole office on February 13th, 1999. When he arrived, police arrested Varian Wardrop and charged him with the murder of Terry Sims. Based on the evidence, police believe Wardrop saw Terry Sims at the door of Lisa Boone's apartment. After forcing his way inside, he tied her hands behind her back, then raped and killed her. Varian Wardrop pled guilty to the capital murders of Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs, and Ellen Blau. He was sentenced to death in the Sims case and received life terms in each of the others. Wardrip also confessed to an additional murder. In all, he had ended the lives of 5 young women. In Texas, a serial killer's guilt was contained in a disposable coffee cup. But on the West Coast, police would have to dig deeper for proof of murder. On November 7, 1988, in Sacramento, California, social worker Judy Moyes contacted Sacramento police about one of her clients, 52-year-old Bert Montoya. She said Bert had disappeared from the boarding house where she placed him. His landlady seemed unsure about his whereabouts. Ms. Moyes told police that Dorothea Puente's boarding house was a refuge for indigent people, many with histories of alcohol and drug abuse. It seemed ideal for Bert, a street person with no place to go. He had his own room and TV and was happy there after years of living on the streets. But after a few months, Bert started saying he wanted to leave. Judy Moyes hadn't heard from Bert in 3 months. Mrs. Puente finally explained that Bert had gone to live with his brother in Utah. That made no sense to Judy Moyes. She knew Bert Montoya didn't have any family. She asked police to look into it. Officers went to interview Dorothea Puente. She seemed a gracious, grandmotherly woman, charming and eager to cooperate. She said Bert had gone to live with family in Utah. One of the residents in the boarding house corroborated the account. But as the officer was leaving, the resident slipped him a note. He wanted to talk. He told police that he'd seen some strange things at the house. Bert wasn't the only one who vanished. Another tenant, Ben Fink, had too. And there were others. But their Social Security checks kept coming. He also described a terrible odor around the boarding house. He said he'd once worked at a mortuary and recognized the smell of death. The police officer filed a missing persons report on Bert Montoya. Detective John Cabrera of the Sacramento Police Department was assigned the case. The name Dorothea Puente was familiar to him. She was known as a champion of the dispossessed.
She was highly respected for all of her charitable things that she had done to the Hispanic community. There were people that visited from other countries who came here to praise her and talk to her. And she was known in the Hispanic community as Doctora, which is Spanish for doctor.
Now, Detective Cabrera requested a background check on Dorothea Puente. Based on her reputation, it wasn't what he expected. He learned that the kindly grandmother was actually only 59 years old and had a criminal history of preying on the elderly. She'd been previously convicted on multiple counts of forging Social Security checks and had served 4 years in prison. For investigators, her MO was surprising.
And she was getting these checks by putting knockout drops in these individuals' drinks. And of course, when they passed out, she took their check and signed it.
Conditions of Dorothea Puente's parole prohibited her from keeping a boarding house. That gave detectives a reason to look deeper into the situation. 4 days after Bert Montoya was reported missing, they met with Judy Moyes, hoping she could provide more information about the boarding house. She said most of the residents were poor, the forgotten elderly who exist on the fringes of society. But Dorothea Puente always had a place for them. And she had a reputation for treating tenants like family. Boys claimed that several other social workers began to notice that their clients sometimes disappeared from the house, never to be seen again. Bert Montoya was the most recent. Perhaps some of the tenants had simply wandered off, or family members had decided to take care of them. Investigators decided to find out. Later that morning, police met with Dorothea Puente. Although they didn't have a warrant, she graciously gave them permission to conduct a search. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, police found prescription medication, a sedative, in the name of Dorothy Miller. Mrs. Puente told them it belonged to a relative who had stayed with her for a while. Investigators asked if they could dig around in her backyard. Mrs. Puente not only gave them permission, she offered to get people in to dig for them. That didn't seem the action of a person with something to hide. Investigators declined her offer and began digging themselves. After finding nothing in 3 holes, they began to think they were wasting their time. But in the 4th, they found corrosive lime, often used to mask odors and speed decay. They decided to keep digging. To their surprise, they uncovered what appeared to be a human leg bone. At a boarding house for the elderly run by 59-year-old Dorothea Puente, Sacramento police uncovered human remains. The coroner's office and a crime scene were dispatched to the scene. Puente agreed to accompany police to the station to make a statement. She was very cooperative and appeared genuinely shocked that bones were found in her yard. She said she had been living there for a little more than a year. Perhaps the previous owner could explain the bones. But Puente's criminal past would not be ignored. Police asked her outright if she'd killed her missing tenant, 52-year-old Bert Montoya. Dorothea Puente calmly denied it. Since there was no evidence of any crime, investigators took Mrs. Puente home. The next morning, the search of the boarding house continued. As more police and excavation equipment arrived, curious onlookers and reporters began to assemble outside the house. Around 9:45, Mrs. Puente asked if she was free to go to the corner coffee shop. Since she'd been so cooperative, the detectives had no proof of her involvement in any foul play. They let her go. 15 minutes later, at 10 a.m., forensic technicians uncovered a second body, wrapped in a tarp, buried under a cement slab. The condition of the tarp indicated that this body hadn't been underground very long. A police officer was dispatched to pick up Dorothea Puente at the coffee shop. She wasn't there.
We sent people over there to find out who had seen her, if anybody had talked to her, what was going on. They went over there and they had ascertained that she had got into a taxi and drove off.
Sacramento police traced the cab and learned it had taken her to the Stockton bus station, 50 miles away. There, they learned she boarded a bus to Los Angeles. Not knowing where she might be heading, investigators launched a nationwide search for Dorothea Puente. She was now wanted on suspicion of murder. At the boarding house, authorities continued digging. Their search for missing person Bert Montoya had unearthed human remains of one victim and a second buried corpse. Mindful of statements that several residents had disappeared, police feared Mrs. Puente's yard might conceal more ugly secrets. The second body had been discovered under a cement slab that seemed out of place. Now they realized that several more sheds, slabs, and planters were oddly situated. They soon discovered the reason for that. Laura Santos, deputy coroner of Sacramento County, supervised the search.
Under every one of these odd-seeming things, like the sink, there was a body. Under the poorly poured piece of concrete, there was a body. Next to the shed that looked hastily assembled, there was a body.
After 3 days, the dig finally came to an end. 7 bodies had been uncovered in Dorothea Puente's yard. Police were dealing with a mass murder. It seemed impossible that 7 people could have been buried right under the neighbors' noses without anyone seeing anything. Hoping for information or witnesses, detectives began interviewing Mrs. Puente's neighbors. It was hard to find anyone with anything negative to say about her.
It was like fighting an uphill battle. The community, first of all, did not want to accept the fact that this gray-haired little woman who they loved so much and who had given so much to the community was responsible for this gruesome task of putting these people in the yard.
While investigators canvassed the neighborhood, the grim task of identifying the 7 victims, 3 men and 4 women, was underway at the Sacramento coroner's office. All the bodies were x-rayed, then forensic pathologists performed autopsies on them. The coroner started with the victim most closely matching Bert Montoya's description. She began by carefully removing layers of wrapping and documenting each. The body, like many of the others, was wrapped in a signature way that suggested a methodical but twisted mind.
Sheets wrapped with duct tape, then quilts stitched together, blankets, then more sheets, more tarps. I remember there were blue tarps on a couple of the cases. And then each layer would somehow be secured either with twine or duct tape or actually stitched with thread. And then the entire bundle perhaps duct taped together.
The wrappings concealed advanced decomposition, which made it impossible to establish a cause of death for any of the victims. But because of the circumstances, all were ruled homicide. The condition of the bodies also prevented pathologists from immediately identifying any of the victims. As Dr. Santos explains,
most people are identified by fingerprints first, next by dental records, and then by other means. 4 out of the 7 bodies were too decomposed to get decent fingerprints from. None of them had any teeth. So the usual methods that we make an identification could not be used.
the tissue samples were sent to forensic labs for further analysis. To aid in identification efforts, investigators tried to locate people who had disappeared from the boarding house. They found the brother of 55-year-old Ben Fink, one of the tenants believed to be missing. But he told police he hadn't heard from Ben in 3 months. Investigators feared Ben Fink had already been found. To build their murder case against 59-year-old Dorothea Puente, police needed physical proof linking her to the victims' deaths. Investigators went through the boarding house again. They found twine, duct tape, and a coffee can with the word lie written on it. Police found dozens of bottles of the prescribed sedative Dalmane. That didn't seem unusual in a boarding house full of elderly people. But investigators noticed all of the Dalmane, although prescribed by several different doctors, was in Dorothea Puente's name. As details of the investigation became public, police began hearing from witnesses who helped them reconstruct an account of Dorothea Puente's daily routine. It seemed she had a penchant for pre-dawn gardening and became very angry if interrupted. They also learned that she insisted on personally collecting the mail every day, particularly at the end of the month.
She was always there to get the mail because, of course, the mail had the checks. And she would take the checks and keep control of all the money.
Investigators learned that nobody had questioned that control. Since most of the boarding house residents had drug or alcohol problems, it seemed a logical way to keep them from lapsing into their old habits. Police believed that by persuading residents to sign their monthly checks over to her, Mrs. Puente would be assured that the money would keep coming even after the tenants disappeared. In fact, she was getting 10 to 12 federal assistance checks each month, some for people who hadn't lived at the boarding house in years. Police believed money was the motive for murder, but they still needed to find their suspect. Despite the manhunt, Dorothea Puente was still at large. On November 16th, less than a week after she fled, investigators got a tip that Dorothea Puente was at a motel in Los Angeles. An elderly man called police when he saw her picture on TV. He'd recognized her as the woman who'd struck up a conversation about his Social Security benefits.
She wanted to know things like, how much he was getting, and was he taking, full benefit of receiving the money. And of course, he was inquisitive. But she had told him that she knew how to raise his money allotment.
Even as a fugitive, she couldn't resist the opportunity to cash in. Her greed had finally caught up with her. Dorothea Puente was finally in custody. Though they believed they knew her motive for the murders, police had no physical evidence linking her to them. In addition, the victims' identities were still unknown. A latent print examiner was brought in. He compared known samples to fingerprints from 3 of the bodies. He confirmed that one of the victims was Bert Montoya. He would soon identify Ben Fink and Dorothy Miller as well. Science had made a liar of Dorothea Puente. But there remained 4 victims without names. Police had compiled a list of 60 people who had received Social Security checks at Dorothea Puente's boarding house. They tried to track down every name on that list. They found most of the people still alive, having moved out of the house for a variety of reasons. But a few were still unaccounted for. They then assembled medical records on each missing person. The files were forwarded to the Sacramento coroner's office. There, forensic pathologists began the painstaking task of comparing x-rays of each body found in the yard to medical records from each of the missing persons. They looked for distinguishing characteristics in the records that could be linked to each victim.
We did find anomalies in the bodies, abnormalities. Like one person had had skull surgery and had evidence that he had a craniotomy. And another person had irregular characteristics of one of her clavicles, and she'd also had some mandible lower jaw fractures in the past. And using that information from the bodies, we were then able to start making comparisons with the medical records we'd obtained from this list that Social Security had provided us.
The victims had all finally been identified, but police were still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle: how they died. Until that question could be answered, authorities would have a hard time proving murder. They hoped the forensic toxicologist would give them answers. In November of 1988, police investigating the murders of 7 people at a Sacramento boarding house enlisted the aid of toxicologist William Phillips at the California Department of Justice. With no obvious cause of death, they hoped he would be able to determine whether drugs or poisons had ended the victims' lives. Phillips began by analyzing all 7 victims' tissue samples with a radioamino acid, or RIA test, which is sensitive to classes of drugs. The test results showed all of the samples contained the sedative flurazepam, which is used widely in Dalbane, the drug found at Dorothea Puente's boarding house. It is a potent sedative, often prescribed for the elderly. It was the first physical evidence linking Puente to the deaths of the 7 victims. Next, Phillips subjected the samples to the tandem mass spectrometer, the only one on the West Coast at the time. The apparatus uses negative ion detection to find the characteristic profile or footprint of individual drugs. Besides detecting the presence of flurazepam or Dalbane in each sample, it also measured the drug's concentration. But because the bodies had been underground for varying periods of time, those concentrations did not necessarily reflect levels present at the time of death. Some of the drug could have seeped into the ground.
The drug Dalbane was present in all the samples, but the concentrations were so varied that no one could say whether or not the drug caused their death. But I was able to link all the samples, all the tissues, the brains, the liver tissues from all these victims to Dorothea Puente.
Investigators believed they had enough evidence to charge Dorothea Puente with the murder of her 7 tenants. Based on the evidence, police believed she would charm residents into giving her control of their money. If they were reluctant, she would invite them into her private rooms and give them a drink laced with drugs. Afterwards, she would methodically wrap the bodies and hire men to dig holes in her backyard. During her pre-dawn gardening, the 59-year-old woman managed to bury her victims. On August 15, 1993, Dorothea Puente was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. The jury was unable to reach verdicts on the other 4 charges. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Serial killers are methodical, skilled at covering their tracks in order to keep killing. But even the cleverest of predators cannot avoid detection for long. Today, forensic scientists, using sophisticated technology, are helping police stop deadly criminals with an urge to kill again. Police investigating the disappearance of a woman in Iowa close in on a suspect. But to prove murder, they must identify a severed torso pulled from the Mississippi River. In Ohio, a grave is unearthed at a construction site. A makeshift coffin and human bones are all investigators have to lead them to a killer. An Illinois state trooper makes a gruesome discovery on the side of the road. Investigators must make their case from the unknown victim's teeth. Some killers believe that they have left no trace of themselves or their victims behind. But forensic scientists have found ways to decipher a killer's calling card by reading clues written in bone. Located on a bend on the Mississippi River, Davenport, Iowa is known as a quiet fishing community. But on March 18, 1983, police were visited by a concerned citizen named Marianne Roth. Marianne was worried about her friend Joyce Clint. They had spoken on the phone earlier in the morning and had made plans to spend the afternoon together. But Joyce hadn't shown up. Joyce had been under a lot of stress in recent weeks. Her marriage was in bad shape, and she and her husband Jim were considering divorce. Marianne described Joyce as a dedicated mother, not the type to simply run off without a word. For the sake of their son Bart, Joyce had tried to keep the marriage together. But she wasn't naive. Marianne turned over a tape that Joyce had made several days before her disappearance. Joyce had planned to use it as evidence if the divorce went to trial. When investigators played the tape, they quickly realized that Joyce had secretly recorded an incriminating conversation between her and Jim. On it, she confronted her husband about money he was allegedly skimming from his chiropractic business. Responding to the threats, Jim told Joyce that if she exposed him, he would put her head under the pillow, smother her, and then cut her up into little pieces. Though it was savage talk, police are used to hearing these kinds of violent threats from couples facing divorce. To investigators, it was more likely that Joyce had decided to leave town. With the tape safe at Marianne's, she could slip away until the divorce case went to trial. That theory was supported the following day. Joyce's friends discovered her car parked near the airport. Inside the vehicle, police found no evidence of a struggle or any signs of foul play. For investigators, everything suggested that Joyce had gone missing on purpose. Corporal Jerry McCabe of the Davenport Police Department worked the investigation.
It first looked like a possible family argument where she may have taken off and hadn't spoken to anybody in a while.
But the persistence of Joyce Clint's friends convinced police to look into the disappearance. They paid a visit to Jim Clint. Jim readily admitted that he and Joyce had fought on the morning of the 18th. He had stormed out and gone to the marina where he kept his boat in order to cool off. Because of rising floodwaters, he decided not to go out on the river. secured his boat and returned home. By that time, he said Joyce was gone, along with a closet full of clothes and $4,000 of his money. Investigators checked on his alibi with a visit to the marina.
Did you see him on March 18th?
A restaurant manager confirmed that she saw Clint that morning, around 11 a.m. She saw Clint loading filled trash bags onto his boat. She said he left the dock in his boat, returned sometime later, and then went out again. This eyewitness account contradicted Jim's alibi. Detectives decided to take a closer look into Jim Clint's background. Jim Clint's drinking and philandering were well known in the small community of Davenport. Police learned that he had been having a blatant affair with one of his patients. Hoping to learn more, investigators tracked the woman down. She told investigators that on the day of Joyce's disappearance, Jim had invited her over around noon. He had a surprise. He said that Joyce agreed to a divorce and had left town. Now they could finally be together. Joyce's threats to expose Jim's alleged embezzling, coupled with the information about his extramarital affair, gave investigators reason to believe that Jim Clint had motive to kill his wife. But without any hard evidence that a crime had been committed, it was still just speculation. But on April 15th, nearly a month after Joyce's disappearance, the Mississippi River would offer a gruesome clue. Several miles south of Davenport, two fishermen noticed something floating in the river. As they got closer, they could see that it was the remains of something human. They fled the scene and called 911. Investigators responded to the riverbank and pulled the body from the water. It was a female torso, severed just above the navel and just below the tops of the thighs. For even the most seasoned detectives, the scene was difficult to comprehend. A limited autopsy determined that the victim was a Caucasian woman who'd been in the water anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 months. The cut marks appeared to have been made by a chainsaw with a 5/16 of an inch chain. Mindful of the violent threats Jim had made on the tape, investigators believed they had found Joyce Clint. But they were a long way from proving murder. To make their case, they would first have to identify the remains. And that wouldn't be easy. Investigators turned to renowned forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow at the University of Oklahoma. His approach is simple.
And basically what we try to do is look at the skeleton, all 200 bones and 32 teeth, and we're trying to answer two questions primarily. Who is this person? Who was this person? And how did they die?
Snow's expertise allows him to develop a profile from the barest of bones. Even with only the torso to work with, Snow could tell a lot about the victim. To determine her age, he studied the area of the pelvis known as the pubic symphysis.
The surfaces of this This joint undergoes some fairly regular changes with age. In younger people, there's a system of strong grooves, you might say, and ridges. They gradually begin to disappear in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, so on, till finally you wind up with a rather flat, featureless surface.
Based on the ridge detail in the victim's pelvis, Snow believed the victim was between 26 and 34 years old. Next, he studied the dimensions of the remaining leg and hip bones and calculated that she was between 5 feet and 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed between 125 and 140 pounds. Even though Joyce Clint fit those measurements, police soon learned that so did dozens of other missing women. Until investigators could narrow down their pool of possible victims, the identity of the severed torso would remain a mystery. Police in Davenport, Iowa struggled with two cases, the disappearance of Joyce Clint and the discovery of a severed torso pulled from the Mississippi River. They believed the cases were connected, and they believed Joyce's husband Jim was responsible. But until they could positively identify the remains, they couldn't prove murder. Using the description of the victim supplied by forensic anthropologist Dr. Clyde Snow, Davenport Police Lieutenant Dennis Kern began a computerized search of all missing women in the region. The computer returned the names of 17 missing women. Detectives were able to eliminate 8 of the women since they had disappeared after the torso was found. 2 of the women were ultimately found, and another 3 didn't match the physical description.
When we were finished with 4 people. One of them was Joyce Clint.
With the investigation taking on a more narrow focus, investigators decided to pay another visit to Jim Clint. They returned to his home, this time with a search warrant. In his garage, they found what they were looking for. A chainsaw with a 5/16 of an inch chain, the same width as the cut marks on the body. Technicians processed the chainsaw with indicator fluid that turns pink in the presence of blood. They covered every square inch of the saw. Not a single drop of blood or tissue could be found. Either Jim Clint was smarter than investigators had imagined, or the torso found in the river was not Joyce Clint. There was only one way to be sure. Police had to find a way to positively identify the remains. Though DNA analysis hadn't yet been developed in 1983, there were new ways of identifying an individual from genetic markers in blood enzymes. Blood samples were subpoenaed from Jim Clint and his son Bart. A comparison with the blood from the victim showed a genetic consistency with Bart. Further tests of Joyce Clint's parents' blood also showed consistent patterns. The genetic information on its own was not enough to establish identity. But out of the 4 unaccounted for women, only Joyce Clint matched both the physical description as described by Dr. Snow and the genetic description provided by the blood tests. The conclusion was unmistakable.
Looking at the women that met these physical characteristics What of those four, what were the odds that any one of them would have matched the genetic picture? And the odds were infinitesimal.
The torso belonged to Joyce Clint, and all of the evidence pointed to her husband Jim as the killer.
There was a division of monies, properties, and that he was going to lose. He was going to have a lot of things taken away from him because she was done, fed up, ready to go. And the girlfriend motive was there. There were so many that he thought that were in his way of a happier life. You know?
Jim was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. Police believe that Jim executed his plan on the morning of March 18th. After murdering Joyce in their home, he drove her remains to a remote spot where he dismembered her with a chainsaw. He used his boat to dispose of the body parts and the saw. He then placed her car near the airport to throw investigators off his trail. Though he maintained his innocence through the trial, the jury found Jim Clint guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Jim Clint thought that dismemberment would keep himself and his victim from ever being identified. In Ohio, a killer tried to avoid prosecution by keeping his horrible secret buried deep in the ground. On June 20th, 1990, in the small northern Ohio town of Elyria, a construction worker uncovered a long-buried secret. His bulldozer struck a hard object, resting several feet beneath the ground. It appeared to be a wooden box. As he walked closer to the find, he was overwhelmed by a horrible odor. He realized he had unearthed a makeshift grave. He called police. Lieutenant Dan Jekyll of the Elyria Police Department was immediately dispatched to the site. Due to the construction, the scene had already been compromised.
But we were concerned about the evidence. The evidence was being pushed down by the bulldozer. There are bits of pieces and wood that might have been carried 25, 30, 40 yards away, besides the initial scene that we had to protect.
That wasn't their only problem. Rain clouds threatened to destroy possible trace evidence. With the site now exposed, they would only have this one chance to get what they needed. To preserve any potential findings, investigators had to treat the scene like an archaeological dig. Sifting through the earth for stray bullets, jewelry, or other identification with deliberate precision. The initial search of the construction site turned up no clues to tell investigators the identity of the victim. After several hours, the badly decomposed body, wrapped in garbage bags, was hand dug from the grave. Despite their continued efforts, no additional evidence or identification was found. Police needed to know who was in the grave before they could figure out how he or she got there. For help, investigators called on distinguished anthropology professor Dr. Owen Lovejoy at Kent State University.
I went out and examined the body and collected some materials, the purpose of which was to provide as many details about that individual in life as I could.
From the condition of the pelvis, examiners were able to determine that the body was a female, somewhere around 28 to 30 years old. An examination into the shape and proportions of the skull told them that the victim was Caucasian. Dr. Lovejoy measured the thigh and arm bones and factored them into an equation to determine the victim's height. She was surprisingly tall, almost 6 feet. Dr. Lovejoy had provided investigators with their first glimpse of how the victim appeared alive. It was now up to them to discover her identity. Detectives started by looking into unsolved missing persons cases. But in all of those cases, none of the missing women fit the description of the buried body. Investigators turned their attention to the only other piece of evidence. Though it seemed like a long shot, they called in a draftsman to measure the fractured pieces of the makeshift coffin and render a detailed illustration of it. Investigators turned the illustration over to the local paper, along with the description of the unidentified woman. Days later, a woman called to say that she thought she recognized the makeshift coffin. The woman remembered admiring the piece in her friend Sandra Stuller's apartment. She told police it had been over 3 years since Sandra disappeared without a goodbye. She wasn't able to offer any speculation on what happened to her old friend, but she was able to give police a valuable piece of information. Like the woman found at the construction site, Sandra Stuller was 6 feet tall. Though still unsure that they'd identified their victim, it was the investigators' only lead. Detectives tracked down an aunt and uncle of Sandra's living in the area. Like the witness who identified the chest, they hadn't seen their niece in the past 3 years. The relatives said that shortly before they lost touch, Sandra had rekindled a relationship with her ex-husband, Doug Hartman. He had been a loving and supportive husband at first, but as the years went by, he grew abusive. Sandra eventually left him, but Doug wanted her back, and against the wishes of her relatives, she decided to give him another chance.
And the family told Sandra, this is a bad move. You should not go back to Douglas Hartman. In fact, if you decide to do that, you're no longer part of this family.
But Sandra stuck with Doug, and the family severed ties. They hadn't heard from her since. Now, investigators needed to pick up the story where the aunt and uncle's account left off. They tracked down the manager of Sandra's last known apartment, where she lived just before she disappeared in 1987. Apparently, the reunion with Doug had been short-lived. Sandra had been living alone at the time. The manager remembered that the circumstances surrounding Sandra's departure were strange. In December of 1987, she saw a man moving Sandra's belongings out of the apartment and into a rental truck. The manager had not seen the man before. She didn't see Sandra that day or ever again. Sandra had abandoned her apartment without a word. Investigators suspected the man moving Sandra's things was Doug Hartman. To prove that theory, they went to the truck rental agency. They pored over hundreds of receipts from 3 years before. On one of the receipts from December of 1987, they found what they came for.
Do you happen to remember anything about this gentleman?
The name of Sandra's ex-husband, Doug Hartman. It was time to question Doug, but there was no record of him living in town. But detectives managed to find a relative still in the area. He told police he hadn't heard from Doug since he had gone to live with his grandmother in Fredericksburg, Virginia, a few years back. Detectives wondered what had prompted Doug to leave town. But their theories would be meaningless until they could prove that the buried remains belonged to Sandra Stuller. Detectives in Elyria, Ohio, believed that the body and the makeshift coffin unearthed at a construction site belonged to Sandra Stuller. And they suspected that her ex-husband, Doug Hartman, had put her there. Word of the investigation into Sandra Stuller's whereabouts spread quickly. A local bank manager contacted detectives. He too had been searching for Sandra. She had stopped paying rent on a security deposit box. Investigators obtained a search warrant. The contents of the box included Sandra's divorce decree, her will, and some diamond and gold jewelry. Not the kind of valuable items a person would carelessly abandon, unless, as Detective Dan Jekyll thought, they had no choice.
And that reinforced my idea that the person that we uncovered on Shadden Road was in fact Sandra Stuller, but I had to prove it.
Detectives were running out of ways to accomplish that goal. Desperate for any information, they plugged Sandra's social security number into a law enforcement database. They got a hit. Sandra had been in a car accident shortly before she disappeared. The report mentioned that she had been taken to the hospital for treatment, which included x-rays. It was the break detectives were looking for.
When I found out that there was a chest x-ray taken, I knew that this would help the case. And when I contacted Dr. Lovejoy, he told me if I can get that original x-ray, there's a real good chance that he could identify the remains.
Investigators visited the hospital and subpoenaed Sandra Stuller's x-rays. Now that they had a source of comparison, they turned back to the expertise of forensic anthropologist Dr. Owen Lovejoy.
Initially, when we looked at her skeleton and compared it to these chest films, we realized that there were a number of very special characters that were very rare. One of these was the fact that she only had 11 ribs, when a normal individual usually has 12. That's a fairly rare abnormality. Another is that the individual had suffered a fracture of her right clavicle. And so these were two characters that matched both the bones that we had.
It was powerful evidence, but not conclusive. Lovejoy next had to examine the very fine details preserved inside the bone. There, small features called trabecula are as unique as the characteristics of a fingerprint. To To make the comparison, Dr. Lovejoy began by re-X-raying the bones with a powerful machine called a faxitron that produces high-resolution images of bone. That completed, he then compared the trabecula one by one.
We did this in this particular case and found that they were in fact an exact match, so that there was no question that these were the remains of Sandra Stoller.
The victim had finally been identified. Investigators now needed to establish and prove motive in her death. Looking through her financial records, they believed they'd found their answer. Prior to her disappearance, Sandra had inherited over $100,000 when her mother died. She had set up a $50,000 mutual fund and had been living off the interest. But a letter in the file, signed by Sandra after she had already been murdered, requested that her assets be transferred to an account in Fredericksburg, Virginia. That account was in the name of Doug Hartman. Sandra Stoller had been murdered for her money.
And through bank records and subpoenas, I was able to track that $51,000 into Douglas Hartman's own personal checking account. I did have a motive then.
Doug was brought back to Ohio for questioning. When investigators confronted him with all of the evidence, he began to crumble. He confessed to killing her, but claimed that it had been an accident. Police believed otherwise. After murdering Sandra and burying her body, Doug fled to Virginia, where he had all of her assets transferred into his bank account. It took a jury less than 6 hours to find Doug Hartman guilty of aggravated murder, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, and theft. He was sentenced to life in prison. Though Sandra Stoller's body had been buried for more than 3 years, investigators were able to solve her murder from the bare bones. In Illinois, investigators had even less to work with. Stretching from Chicago to Springfield, I-55 is one of the most heavily traveled highways in Illinois. State troopers regularly cruise its length, hunting down speeders. But on March 10, 1986, it was not a speeder that caught the troopers' attention. Something was burning on the side of the road. As the officer approached, he thought it was a mannequin that had been set on fire. But as he got closer, he realized it was something far more disturbing. It was the charred mass of a human body. After extinguishing the blaze, the trooper called for backup. The following morning, evidence technicians from the Illinois Division of Criminal Investigations began processing the area for clues. The scene offered little indication as to who could have committed this brutal act. The only potential evidence was a set of tire tracks imprinted in the soil. But on a well-traveled highway, they could have belonged to anyone. Technicians made a plaster mold of the tread marks in the hopes a suspect would emerge and could then be placed at the scene. But finding a suspect would be difficult, if not impossible, until detectives could identify the remains. At autopsy, The examiner concluded the female victim had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The only identifying features that survived the fire were her teeth. A pearl necklace and a ring bearing the letter E were removed from the victim. Based on her petite stature and slender hip dimensions, the examiner believed the victim to be between 18 and 25 years old, and possibly Hispanic. For Lieutenant Carlos Heviat of the Illinois Department of Criminal Investigations, the information wasn't a lot to go on.
The first order of business is to identify who's the victim. In this particular case, we had difficulty because of the fact that we didn't have a photograph to go around when we were doing canvassing.
Nonetheless, investigators began questioning people in the neighborhoods around the scene of the fire. One clerk at a nearby gas station remembered selling a can of gasoline the night before. He helped investigators come up with a composite. The sketch was publicized, but no one came forward to name the suspect. Investigators launched a statewide media campaign. A flood of tips came in, but after 2 weeks, detectives still couldn't match the remains to any missing persons cases. With their whole case hinging on identification, investigators sought help from the state's Forensic Anthropology Department. After taking a life-sized X-ray of the victim's skull, they built a three-dimensional model, sculpting a face in modeling clay. It might not be an identical match, but hopefully it would bring about a spark of recognition from the public. Photographs of the reconstructed head and the victim's ring were sent to local press. But again, no one came forward to identify the young woman. Now, several weeks after the murder, chances of solving the case were dwindling away. A methodical killer still walked the streets. After several weeks, investigators were no closer to solving the brutal murder of an unidentified woman, whose body had been set on fire and left burning on the side of an Illinois highway. Desperate to identify the remains, investigators sent the victim's skull and teeth to Dr. Stephen Smith, a consultant in forensic dentistry.
In the worst of circumstances, the teeth pretty well survive. And so because of that, we become very useful for the uniqueness of the human dentition. We can find the uniquenesses that everybody has in their dentition. And that's enough to separate us from one human being to another.
The arch of the jaw suggested that the victim was most likely Asian, not Hispanic. After studying the general anatomy, Dr. Smith examined each individual tooth.
This would be the temporary cement that would indicate that this person is probably going to be going back to the dentist. And I see some bone loss in this area. This would indicate periodontal disease, and the person probably was possibly seeing a periodontist.
This kind of dental history gave Dr. Smith new insight into the victim's age.
As I looked at this information and as I came to my independent evaluation, I thought this person had to be at least in their 40s. 38 to 40, maybe 42, 43, somewhere like that, but not more than 5-year difference.
Dr. Smith's detailed analysis had exposed a critical flaw in the original description of the victim. She couldn't have been between the ages of 18 and 25 as previously thought. He showed that she was some 20 years older than that.
In this particular case, we were scrambling because we were chasing an 18 to 25-year-old missing person that was not our victim. So when they came up with that, it was like somebody just opened the door, you know.
Now, almost 2 months after the burning body had been found, detectives went back to the statewide police computer network and modified the victim's description. The new findings paid off. Within hours of modifying their search, investigators received a call from nearby DuPage County Sheriff's Department. They had a missing persons case that matched the new description. Illinois State Police met with DuPage County Sheriffs to discuss the case. They learned Erlinda Anderson was a 43-year-old housewife reported missing by her sister in early March. Born in the Philippines, she'd come to the United States to marry her husband, William. The fact that this victim's name began with the letter E led investigators to believe they were on the right track. Deputies told investigators that they had met with William Anderson shortly after his wife was reported missing. He was questioned about his wife and their marriage. It hadn't been a traditional courtship. During the interview, Anderson admitted that he'd met Erlinda through a classified ad. She was looking for an American husband. He was looking for companionship. The relationship started well, Anderson said. She seemed very happy with the comforts of middle-class America. But as the marriage wore on, Erlinda became very homesick. He insisted Erlinda wasn't missing. In fact, he'd seen her board a plane bound for the Philippines in early March. Following up on William Anderson's story, DuPage County investigators questioned Erlinda's friends. They confirmed that Erlinda had been unhappy with her life in the U.S., mostly because of her marriage to William. And she had been longing to return home. But it was strange that they hadn't heard from their friend in months. William Anderson's inconsistent story, coupled with Dr. Smith's forensic analysis, led investigators to now believe the victim found burning on the side of the road was Erlinda Anderson. And that would make her husband the leading suspect in her murder. But so far, there was no evidence to prove it. Investigators from the Illinois Department of Criminal Investigations were getting closer to identifying charred remains found along the highway. They believed the victim was 43-year-old Erlinda Anderson. But until they could be sure, police wouldn't be able to make a case against the prime suspect, her husband, William. With only the victim's teeth to work with, investigators subpoenaed Erlinda's dental records. They were sent to forensic dentist Dr. Stephen Smith for comparison. While awaiting the results of his examination, detectives began scrutinizing William Anderson's alibi. He had claimed that he had seen Erlinda board a plane bound for the Philippines. Investigators paid a visit to the airlines. Anderson had in fact purchased a ticket to Manila in Erlinda's name. But a week before her body was found, records showed that William Anderson cashed in the ticket. Erlinda never boarded a plane to the Philippines. William Anderson had been caught in a blatant lie. But if Anderson had killed his wife, the question now before investigators was why. A further background check revealed that Erlinda had been William's fifth wife. Based on a search of Anderson's phone records, they learned that he probably didn't intend her to be his last. Many of the bills reflected calls to one of Anderson's female co-workers. The woman, who was married, reluctantly admitted that she and Anderson had been having an affair. Anderson complained to her that Erlinda was constantly spending his money, always sending gifts to her friends and family in the Philippines. The day after the body was found, William took her out for a romantic dinner. He told her to leave her husband and marry him instead.
She questioned Anderson about, what about your wife? And Anderson told her, don't worry about my wife, she's not coming back.
The case was now in the hands of forensic dentist Dr. Stephen Smith. When making an identification, Smith superimposes the living dental records with the x-rays made after death.
On this case here, I can take and move it around, and all of a sudden I see a clear picture. It was fuzzy, now it's totally clear. It means that the one film overlays the other one perfectly. In myself, if I'm asked, is this a match? I could say yes. I would be assured, looking at this film, that this film matches that film, and I could say that this dentition belongs to that remains.
After months of frustration, the burned body had finally been identified as Erlinda Anderson. And with a new romance brewing, William Anderson had motive to get rid of her. Still lacking physical evidence linking him to the murder, investigators gave him another visit. They asked him to follow them to the police station for further questioning. While police began their interrogation, a warrant was obtained to search Anderson's car. Though the tire treads did not match those found at the crime scene, the trunk and the items inside it were splattered with red stains. Indicator tests confirmed the presence of human blood on a windbreaker and a tire iron. The blood was too deteriorated to make a detailed comparison, but it was one more piece of incriminating evidence. The results of the examination were brought up to police. William Anderson was placed under arrest. Investigators believe that Anderson used the tire iron to beat Erlinda in the head. After she was dead, he drove her body down Interstate 55. He doused her body in gasoline, thinking that all his problems would burn away in the ensuing fire. Without the insights of forensic dentistry, he might have gotten away without a trace. A jury found William Anderson guilty of murder and sentenced him to life in prison. Some killers are determined to keep the identity of their victims a secret. When they are successful, their deeds threaten to go unpunished. But forensic scientists can breathe life into a dying investigation and find justice written in bone. In small-town Maine, police pursue the killer of a young mother for 20 years, waiting for technology to match their perseverance. A student disappears on his way to class. A ransom is demanded. Is it a kidnapping, con game, or something far more sinister? Detectives in Washington State must find a way to outsmart a killer who knows their every move before he slips through their fingers. Murders of passion can often lead investigators straight to a killer. But when the clues are few and the leads tenuous, detectives know they are searching for something emotionless. A killer who is cold-blooded. Norwich Walk, Maine, November 23rd, 1976. Police discover a car in the bushes near River Road. The engine still running. There was no one in sight. The officer called in the license plate number. The dispatcher said the car had been reported missing by the owner, Vaughn Stevens. Stevens claimed that his girlfriend had borrowed the car earlier in the evening to do some shopping, but did not return. Inside the vehicle, the officer discovered blood on the passenger seat. Vaughn Stevens was contacted and asked to respond to the scene. The officer continued to examine the vehicle. Inside the trunk, partially covered by a jacket, he discovered the body of a woman. She was wearing only a pair of socks. Homicide investigations in rural areas fall to the state police. After being notified, investigators began to scour the area for clues. When Vaughn Stevens arrived with a friend, he positively identified his car. His friend had to identify the victim in the trunk. She was Stevens' girlfriend, 30-year-old Janet Baxter. Distraught, Stevens was allowed to leave the scene. Maine State Police Detective Chick Love continued his investigation.
In the car, we found the groceries that she had purchased at the store that night. We found the sales slip, the cash register tape that told us what store she was in and exactly what time that she was there.
The coroner's autopsy revealed Janet Baxter had been shot in the head and chest with bullets from a .22 caliber handgun. She had also been raped. Biological evidence from her body was preserved for testing on glass slides known as slide mailers. The bullets and slide mailers were sent to the crime lab for further analysis. The car Janet had been driving also underwent a thorough investigation. Forensics experts dusted the exterior and discovered a set of latent fingerprints. In the trunk, a single pair was retrieved. Later examination showed it did not belong to Baxter. Hoping to find witnesses, detectives began canvassing the area near River Road. One resident, Clarice Merrill, said she had seen something odd the night before. While driving home, Merrill saw two vehicles pull off the road at the same location where Janet Baxter's body was later found. One of the cars was a yellow Volkswagen. Merrill believed the other car was a Ford LTD. Inside, she saw a man and a woman. The woman appeared to be asleep. Merrill helped create a composite drawing of the man in the LTD, while police began making efforts to locate the yellow bug. In most murder cases, spouses and significant others are always considered suspects. The victim's boyfriend, Vaughn Stevens, was questioned in depth the next day. He agreed to take a polygraph test. He told police that Janet Baxter worked as a nurse and had recently been through a bitter divorce. She had custody of her daughter, Julie. Around 9:30, Janet decided to go to the store. Stevens' car was blocking the driveway. He gave her his keys. Janet said she would be back in a few minutes.
Midnight, she didn't show up.
When she failed to return, he phoned police. The polygraph test indicated Stevens was telling the truth. Detectives also questioned Baxter's ex-husband, but he had a solid alibi, and like Stevens, he was dismissed as a suspect. Investigators continued searching the area for a yellow Volkswagen.
Can I help you? Good evening. I'm Detective Chick Love. I'd like to ask a few questions.
A local resident, Galen Lessard, owned a similar car.
I'm not involved in this.
When questioned, he was uncooperative and refused to be interviewed.
You got the wrong person. You need to see someone else. Okay, bye.
Investigators probed Lessard's background. Though nothing in his records indicated he was capable of murder, investigators learned he was friends with other men in town. Their records told a different story. One was a suspect in the murder of a college co-ed 5 years earlier. Another slightly resembled the composite drawing Merrill had helped police assemble. But none of these men would talk to authorities. The investigation threatened to turn cold. On November 28th, almost a week since the murder, an officer noticed a white sedan parked at exactly the same spot where Janet Baxter's body was found. A man was standing outside the car. He appeared to be looking for something. The officer noted the registration and passed it along. Investigators ran a check on the plates and learned the car belonged to a man named Albert Cochran. A background check revealed that Cochran had done prison time in Illinois after pleading guilty to murdering his wife in 1964. Despite a sentence of 50 to 75 years, he was paroled after 12 years. In early 1976, his parole was transferred to the same town in Maine where Janet Baxter lived. Cochran was brought in for questioning. He claimed that on the night of the murder, he was smoking marijuana and drinking with 3 strangers in the parking lot of a local bar. They invited him to a party, but he didn't want to leave his car near the bar, so he moved it to a supermarket parking lot. The same one Janet Baxter had visited the night she was murdered. Cochran said he got in the stranger's car, but made them pull over and let him out when he became suspicious of them. He claimed he then walked several miles to his brother's home in Norridgewock. On the way, he stated he saw police gathered at an area off of River Road. Though he refused to take a polygraph, investigators obtained fingerprints and samples of his hair for comparison with previously gathered evidence. Cochran's fingerprints were examined and compared to those lifted from the exterior of the car in which Baxter was found. His hair sample was compared against the hair found in the car's trunk. Neither the prints nor the hair samples produced a match. There was no hard evidence pointing to Cochran as the murderer. The investigation hit an impasse. For the next 20 years, the case was passed down through dozens of detectives, each one running into the brick wall presented by the lack of hard evidence. It seemed Janet Baxter's death would never be solved, but her family refused to let it go. "20 years have passed since the murder of 30-year-old Janet Baxter in the small New England town of Norridgewock, Maine. During those years, no arrests have been made. Robert McCleary, Janet Baxter's father, was determined to keep the case alive, no matter how long it took to solve. Every year on the anniversary of his daughter's death, he would call police headquarters.
My desire to continue my contact with the state police was deeply motivated by my desire to see that somebody paid for what they had done to Jan. That somebody was not going to get away with murder, and that to continue to seek the information, to continue the investigation, and to give us some sense of closure.
In 1996, the case was handed over to Maine State Police Detective Mike Mitchell. After reviewing the case files, Mitchell paid a visit to Janet Baxter's parents. The detective had grown up near Norridgewock and had been in elementary school when the murder occurred.
Mr. McClary, Mrs. McClary, I'm a detective with the Maine State Police.
He promised he would do everything in his power to solve this case.
If you have any questions of me, don't hesitate to call.
Mitchell began by retracing the steps of the previous investigation. He was struck by the loose ends presented by the owner of the yellow Volkswagen, Galen Lassard, and his cronies who refused to talk to police. Despite those unresolved issues, he decided to take another crack at Albert Cochran.
Some detectives felt that Albert Patrick Cochran was a suspect and was the person responsible for the murder of Janet Baxter. Some detectives felt that it was another group of people that socialized together. So what I did is I took down all the names of all possible suspects that hadn't been alibied, not to have been in the area at the time, and listed them all down on a piece of paper, and by priority as to who looked like a better suspect than the others. And Albert Patrick Cochran was on the top of the list.
To make his case, Mitchell first had to inventory what evidence had survived over the years. He contacted Maine State Police forensic chemist Chris Montagna.
My two roles were to see what was still around as far as evidence that had survived 20 years, and second, to reconstruct the notes and the work that had been done 20 years earlier and try and piece all that together and link it to a suspect that Detective Mitchell was working on as the murderer of Janet Baxter.
Now let's see what you've got.
Searching through the boxes of evidence, investigators found the original slide mailers. One looked blank, but was thought to possibly contain swabs of biological evidence from the victim's body. If the evidence had remained intact, it might be possible to extract DNA, a technique not in existence 20 years before. Under the microscope, the slide surprised everyone, revealing the presence of biological evidence removed from Janet Baxter. Now, investigators needed to find a DNA sample from Cochran. They did not have to go far to find what they needed. The sample of Cochran's hair collected in 1976 was also preserved in the file. But would the hair have viable material for DNA testing? Forensic DNA specialist David Munich was given the assignment.
These head hair samples were known head hair samples. When they're collected, they're actually plucked from the head, and they have skin attached to the hair root, as opposed to hairs that are cut or hairs that just naturally fall out of your head.
Both samples provided ample material to perform the DNA test. When the tests were concluded and comparisons made, the results were overwhelming. The DNA tests showed there was only one chance in 37 billion that Janet Baxter's killer was somebody other than Albert Cochran. Munich called Detective Mitchell with the news.
And when it came back a perfect match, I can remember I was driving down the road, I picked up my car phone, and I just couldn't believe it. My eyes filled up with water thinking that it was, something you'll never forget. In March, I think March 17th, 1938. He's about 62 years old.
But where was Albert Cochran?
C-O-C-H-R-A-N.
Computer checks tracked him down to an address in Stuart, Florida. On the morning of March 17, 1998, Detective Mitchell and Florida police arrested Cochran at his home. He was extradited to Maine to stand trial for the murder of Janet Baxter. Based on the evidence gathered over 21 years earlier, detectives believe Cochran had seen Janet Baxter alone in a deserted grocery store parking lot. His prior history of violence reasserting itself, Cochran seized the opportunity to abduct his victim, later raping and killing her. On May 20th, 1999, it took a jury only 2.5 hours to find Albert Cochran guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, this time without the possibility of parole. Murder is not the only cold-blooded crime. In South Dakota, a mother's only son is held for ransom. Aberdeen, South Dakota, May 8, 1985. 20-year-old Michael Kinney left the home he shared with his mother, Sandra McNeil, to attend classes at Northern State College.
Bye.
When Michael didn't return by the following morning, his mother became concerned. She decided to look for her son. Near the house, she found Michael's car parked on the side of the road. Michael was nowhere in sight. Sandra McNeil contacted the sheriff's office. Brown County Sheriff Mark Milgren was assigned to look into the disappearance.
We had some concerns due to the fact that Michael Kinney's car was found across the roadway from his residence and have been parked there for, we're assuming, anywhere from 24 to probably 35 hours, 36.
The following day, Sandra McNeil received a mysterious phone call from an unidentified man. The caller told her to go to a bar in Aberdeen later that evening and look for an envelope under the payphone if she wanted to find out what happened to her son. She was told not to contact the police. Kenny's mother went to the bar and found an envelope hidden beneath the payphone. Inside was a ransom note demanding $200,000 in exchange for her son. Despite the kidnapper's warning, Sandra McNeil gave the note to sheriff's investigators, who examined it for clues. South Dakota Department of Criminal Investigations agent Doug Lake was brought in to assist with the investigation. His first priority was to deal with the difficulties of obtaining the money.
Ransom money was the victim's mother's money, and it was on Friday after the bank was closed, and the agents, the investigators went around to the different banks in town and gathered up all the cash that they had on hand.
3 days after her son disappeared, Kitty's mother received a second phone call. This time, investigators were listening. Sandra McNeil was instructed to leave the money in Aberdeen Park at 9 p.m. Investigators traced the call to a public phone box, but the kidnapper hung up and disappeared before the police could close in. The phone had been wiped clean of records. Investigators studied the tape. The caller stated Michael was not hurt, but refused to allow him to talk to his mother until the ransom was paid. The kidnapper described Michael's clothing to authenticate this threat. Investigators felt they had no choice but to follow the kidnapper's demands. The money for the ransom was bundled and placed into a briefcase. Investigators also placed a hidden tracking device inside. An undercover female police officer made the ransom drop as scheduled. A short while later, the briefcase was retrieved by a man who then ran off with more than he bargained for. Police quickly followed. The suspect drove to a residence where he parked the blue Oldsmobile he was driving. Transferred the briefcase containing the ransom money to an orange Camaro, and was joined by an unidentified female from inside the residence. Led by the tracking device, agents followed the suspects across the Minnesota border. Just inside Minnesota, a roadblock halted the suspects' flight. They were ordered out of their car and arrested. The driver was identified as 19-year-old Todd Miller. The passenger was his 17-year-old sister. Agents retrieved the briefcase from the Camaro's trunk. The car was closely examined for clues, but there was no sign of Michael Kinney or any other leads to his whereabouts. Investigators questioned the suspect separately. After a thorough interrogation, investigators found that Miller's sister genuinely appeared to have no clue about Kinney's disappearance or the ransom money. She was released. Todd Miller told police a drug dealer named Bob Jacobs had asked him to pick up a package and deliver it to him in Minnesota. Miller claimed that in return, Jacobs had promised to help him financially. When asked if he knew Kinney, Miller said he was a good friend, but he had no idea Jacobs' job was in any way related to Kinney's disappearance. Miller's story provided investigators with an opportunity. They would use him in a sting operation to nab the drug dealer. The ransom money was returned to him. He was transported to the prearranged delivery point. Jacobs never appeared. Detectives brought Miller back to the police station. The following day, Miller admitted that Jacobs' story was a lie. The kidnapping had been a hoax. Claiming it was all Michael Kinney's idea, Miller explained he had helped stage the entire plot. Miller said he had been friends with Kinney since high school. Alleging Kinney dabbled in various drugs and wanted to move to Canada, Miller stated he was recruited into the kidnapping scam as a way to help Kinney finance his planned relocation. Detectives put Miller through an extensive polygraph test.
Did you harm Michael?
The results of the test were inconclusive, but tended to show the overall truthfulness of his statements. That meant Michael Kinney was alive and on the run. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Police in South Dakota continued their search for 20-year-old Michael Kinney. What had initially appeared to be a kidnapping was now starting to look like a deception. Kinney's friend, Todd Miller, claimed to be a reluctant participant in helping Michael Kinney stage his own disappearance and extort his mother. As the result of Miller's story, a warrant was issued for Kinney's arrest, but his whereabouts remained a mystery. Detectives questioned Kinney's girlfriend. She told them she was with Michael the night before he was reported missing. He had dropped her off at her house after they had been out for a pizza and soda. She had not seen or heard from him since. Weeks later, an Aberdeen farmer made a startling discovery. After noticing a foul odor coming from an unused ice house on his property, he entered the building. There, he found a body. Police were immediately called to the scene. Though the body was badly decomposed, investigators found evidence of 3 bullet wounds and what appeared to be blunt trauma injuries to the victim's head. The farmer had no idea who the victim was or how the body ended up in the ice house. Through dental matches, police would soon learn the victim's identity. They had found Michael Kinney.
It was a big impact on us. All of a sudden we went from a possible theft by deception warrant to a kidnapping, murder, a homicide.
At At the autopsy, the cause of death was determined to be a bullet wound to the aorta. Fibers, perhaps from a rug, were collected from the victim's clothing. It was estimated he had been dead for 2 to 3 weeks, possibly from the time of his disappearance. With Michael Kinney dead, the investigation shifted back to Todd Miller. For investigators, it was clear that he was the killer. But now they had to prove it. To determine if he had written the ransom note, he was returned to the police station to provide handwriting samples. While waiting for those results, warrants to search Miller's cars were obtained. Investigators discovered that the blue Oldsmobile Miller used to pick up the ransom money had been recently washed. However, detectives managed to find 2 hairs that had survived the cleaning. Fiber samples from the trunk were also collected. Next, the interior of the trunk was treated with luminol. This process revealed evidence of blood, but the samples were too deteriorated for analysis. The evidence was hand-delivered to State Crime Lab analyst Rex Reese for comparison. Reese compared fibers removed from Kinney's clothing to those removed from the trunk of Miller's vehicle.
There was an association of the fibers that comprise the liner in the trunk and present as loose fibers on the metal part of the base, bottom of the trunk itself. These were black rayon synthetic textile fibers that comprise this liner. Present on Mr. Kinney's clothing were a number of these same type of black fibers.
Though the analysis was incriminating, it was only circumstantial. Investigators needed hard evidence that Michael Kinney had been in the trunk of Miller's car. Reese next compared the 2 hairs recovered from the Oldsmobile's trunk with those taken from Kinney's head during autopsy. But Reese could only make a general comparison. The hairs recovered from the trunk were too damaged for a conclusive analysis.
The hairs had been severed at the proximal end or near the scalp by blunt force, so we couldn't see any of the root structures there. But they exhibited human hair characteristics that were most similar to that of Mr. Kinney.
Reese's analysis brought investigators one step closer to making their case. But it still wasn't enough. Experts conducted an extensive examination of Miller's handwriting. The unique characteristics identified in the ransom note matched those from Miller's sample. Despite his protests, Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Detectives determined that Miller had wanted to help his father get out of financial problems. He turned to the person he called his friend. On the night of May 8, 1985, Michael Kinney dropped off his girlfriend and headed back home. Police theorized that he was flagged down by his friend. Completely unaware of what was about to befall him, Kinney was an easy mark for the cold-blooded violence Miller had planned. After striking Kinney's head, Miller loaded him into the trunk of his car and quickly fled the scene. Miller drove to an isolated farm, where he then shot and killed the still unconscious Kinney. To cover his tracks, Miller hid the body in a derelict ice house. He then returned home and coldly set in motion his plans to extort Kinney's mother. At his trial, Tom Miller was found guilty of first-degree murder kidnapping, possession of ransom money, and forgery. He received 2 life terms plus 20 years. In a criminal Preston, Washington, another